Edge of Sports on the PPI Network.
It is the 6th annual Shirley Povich Symposium at the Philip Merrill School of Journalism at the University of Maryland, and some tremendous guests. The highlights, clearly, NFL Hall of Famer Bobby Mitchell and Darrell Hill, two men 50 years ago who integrated their respective sports. Bobby Mitchell with the Washington Redskins, the last professional football team to have an African-American on its roster, and Darrell Hill integrating the ACC. Have a listen.
Mitchell ran for 232 yards on 14 carries. The Redskins, noted Povich in his column, have scouted Bobby Mitchell mainly from the rear. Classic. Classic Bobby Mitchell, classic Shirley Povich. So we are here to talk about those times and also to talk about present times. And what has changed? Has all that changed? Or are there areas that we need help in? So I'm glad Teresa's here because she talked about the integration of the National Football League in the beginning, how it happened. Because it's very strange. It's the same as baseball. Baseball had black players in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. Football had players much earlier than Marion Motley and the Cleveland Browns and some of the others. They had a guy named Fritz Pollard, who's one of the great football players of all time. So Teresa knows what the climate was like. And then I want to talk to Darrell about what the climate was like in college sports. So Teresa, give me a background. What was happening in the 1940s and 50s?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here as a panelist. I'm pretty honored to be sitting up here with everyone. But as Mr. Povich noted, you had a situation where people like Fritz Pollard and even Paul Robeson, who people know more for his singing and acting, but actually was a fabulous football player, had been playing professional football. And you ended up with a situation towards the kind of late 20s, early 1930s, where it's a combination of financial situations because you have the Great Depression going on and the sport is starting to contract, and there's this sentiment of if a black player is out there, they must be taking the job of a white player. And then you also had that combined with kind of the leadership and leadership role of a gentleman named George Preston Marshall. And so you ultimately end up with what they say is a gentleman's agreement, where for 13 years, there were no black players in the sport of professional football, and the last two were Joe Lillard and Ray Kemp. And what happens is coming out of World War II, where you started to see the Tuskegee Airmen and you've seen black soldiers go abroad and fight for this country and then come back to a racist country where they can't eat in certain places and their prisoners of war are actually able to eat in restaurants that they're not even able to eat in. You have this kind of uprising to say, we have this double V campaign where we wanted victory against racism abroad and victory against racism here. And you start to see it in sports. And so everyone thinks of Jackie Robinson and, in 1947 in the Brooklyn Dodgers, but the year before, you actually had two different teams that set it up. You had what they were the Cleveland Rams, and then Dan Reeves had wanted to move the team out to LA, and much like the situation with Mr. Marshall, wanted to move into a stadium where there was federal, to the LA Coliseum, where it was a situation where it was federally funded. And so you had a lot of black journalists stand up and say, there's no way you should be moving into this team without black players. So they actually took two well-known UCLA players, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, who actually were past their prime when they started to play for the LA Rams. And at the same time, you had Paul Brown, who was just this visionary who was ahead of his time. He wasn't being forced by anyone to integrate, but he was now running the Cleveland Browns, and he brought on Bill Willis and Marion Motley, both of whom had played for him at either Ohio State or the Great Lakes. And so you now have these two sets of teams, or these two teams that have now brought integration to the forefront and starts the movement towards blacks in pro football.
And so the last team, of course, is the Redskins to integrate. And of course, we all know Marshall's reasons why. He always put on the fact that he had an a great Southern audience. Washington was the most Southern team in the league at the time. And so therefore he didn't want to give up his Southern franchise, and that's why he did not integrate, or that's what he said. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So he finally makes this deal for Bobby. And what I've always wanted to know is what Bobby thought the first day he comes to a town in which before there were no people who looked like him. What was it like?
You don't really. No, it was a shocker really for me because we had a pretty good team at Cleveland, and I just got through playing 4 years with Jim Brown. And when you're lining up next to the best, all you're doing is just smiling and letting them run. I arrived and realized right away that I had gone from a championship title type team to a team that had won one game. I said, boy, they really dislike me over there. But it was a very...
How did he treat you?
George Preston?
Yeah.
I never met the guy. I tell you what really happened with that. Mr. Marshall was, when I came in town to meet with him, Bill McPeak, who was the coach at that time.
A lovable man.
Yeah, very great guy. Carried me downstairs, and Mr. Marshall's office was in the basement. And you know how you see pictures of a guy, but you don't know what he's going to look like in person. And I went downstairs with Bill and sitting at this desk, Mr. Marshall, and said, gosh, he's not a very nice looking man. But his only concern was that Bill McPeak had just taken my contract downstairs to him from the Cleveland Browns the year before. And I'd had a great year, so naturally, like everybody else, I'm looking for a raise. So he said, we are very glad to have you here. And when he said that, I looked to be sure if that's what he was saying to me. And but he immediately went to the contract, which he had in his hand. And he said, Bill said that you want a raise. And back then you did a new contract every year. We didn't do multi-contracts. And usually after the season you talk contract. So I said, yes, I thought I had an awful good year. He said, well, I guess Paul Brown have to pay you. I said, no, sir, I'm with you. And the problem was that my contract would make me the highest paid player on the Redskins. And not that it was a big contract, mind you. And he didn't want to give me any more money. And I said, somebody owe me some money. Somebody. And we went back and forth on this. And then he turned to Bill McPeak and he said, Bill, he said, if we had had Bobby Mitchell here this past year, how many more games would we have won? Bill said, honestly, Mr. Marshall, if Bobby had been with us this past year, we would have won at least 4 or 5 more games. So he spit out his coffee. And he said, well, we don't have a lot of money. And he went on this, because I think for those who...
He was one of the all-time cheap owners ever.
Well, his feeling was there was only one person he paid, and that's the quarterback. And that was the only guy that he ever would give money to. So this was kind of breaking claim. And I got a wife at home saying, you better get my money. And she hasn't met this man. But we talked about it and got a contract. And here's another interesting thing. the Redskins had a young quarterback, Norm Snead, some of you heard his name, who had just completed his rookie year and had a real good year, even though they lost most of their games. And he had gotten a good contract for that time. And when Mr. Marshall and I got through going around with it, and I got this new contract, was extended what he normally would pay someone, the very next day, I get a call from Norm Snead. And I really don't know him other than we played against him. And he said, Bobby, he said, what's going on? I said, what do you mean? He said, I just got a call from the Redskins. And they want to give me some more money. I said, well, why are you calling me? Take it! And what it was, they didn't like the idea of a quarterback salary not being as close to anyone else on the team. And I thought
but there was no talk about, now Bobby, you know the circumstances here. There's a way that you have to conduct yourself.
Well, one of the things he said to me, very interesting, was that after we got through with everything, and he said, well, I want to tell you that we're welcome here, and I just want to tell you that I want you to be a good guy, and I already told you I didn't want you to ask for too much money, and I want you to stay out of politics. This is a political town, and just do for us what you did for Cleveland. And based on the contract he gave me, I felt that I owed it to him to say that I'll give you what I gave Cleveland. And a big smile came across his face. I didn't know the amount of hell I was going to catch afterwards. But that's another story.
With Bobby, can I interrupt just for a second? Can you tell the story about your first night in Washington with Mo Siegel and Joe and Mo's having dinner?
Duke's Zebras.
Was it Duke's? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
this
about
was
the first
actually
night.
almost a year after that. But we were sitting at Duke's Zebras, and that was my second time going.
For the younger people, that was the sports restaurant in the city, the
very
place to be
beautiful
seen.
place, yeah. That was my second time going there. I knew that I never saw any blacks there, but Duke was very, very nice. And Gwen and I was sitting with Maurice Siegel at a table where people walked through going in and out of the restaurant. He had two rooms. He had the front room where people like the commissioner would be seated. He was a college student then, but later on, I think. And then as you went through that opening, you went into the rest of the restaurant where the common folks. Well, Maury and I and Gwen and another couple were sitting right at that door at a table. And we were just getting started with our food. Walking by us was three gentlemen. And when they got to us, was I was sitting on the end, and started by me, the guy spit on my shoe. And I'm a person who like Malcolm X. And so I started up out of my seat. And Maury grabbed me and said, no, nothing happened. And virtually wrestled me down to make sure I didn't explode. And when you think about it, he really saved my career, because I swear that the gentleman who did that was a congressman from the Hill. And so I couldn't have won that, as you know. So he saved me, and a lot of people along the way did the same thing for me.
We'll be talking about that throughout the evening. Now let's go to another part of the city. Northeast Washington, there's this young, wonderful football player named Darrell Hill. He goes to a school named Gonzaga. And for all of you people in Washington, particularly, who go back to those days, right after Brown versus Board of Education, the #1 schools in the city who integrated before anybody else were the parochial schools. They accepted people of color long before any of the public schools or the other private schools. So Darrell Hill was at Gonzaga. Are you recruited by Maryland? Anybody talk to you?
Maryland? Are you kidding?
Maryland.
No.
Considered a southern school at the time.
Maryland didn't even enter my thought processes because Maryland played in the South. And at the time, Division I sports in the South were all segregated, not just football. There were no African-American players playing anything at any major college below the Mason-Dixon line. So if you were from Florida and you were a black kid, you had to go to Illinois and play with Bobby, or you didn't play, or you played for Florida A&M. Now, think about this for a minute. Most of the kids couldn't go north, so most of the black kids from Florida played for Florida A&M. Imagine what kind of football team that was. I remember Ralph Regent asked me, he said, well, where, I'm addressing the kids in the auditorium one day, and so the kids are like incredulous, you know, there couldn't have been segregation like that. So they said, well, where, if the black kids in Maryland couldn't go to College Park, where did they go? I said, well, they went to Morgan State, or they went to Maryland State, which is now Maryland Eastern Shore. And I said, you know, my friends at Morgan State used to tease me and say, oh, we'll beat you Terps, you know. And I said, are you kidding? You know, we're Division I. You guys are Division 4A or something. You know, yeah, right? You could never beat us. And so just the whole football team sitting there, I said, okay, now suppose all the black kids in this room went to Morgan State and the white kids went to Maryland. Who would win? They started laughing. You know? So that's the way it was. I went to Gonzaga, and great school. They were good by me.
Did you feel any
prejudice there?
Yeah.
Not at all, actually. Only when we played St. John's, one of my nemesis is sitting in the audience here, Joe Maynard. Actually, I never played with a black football player. I went to 4 colleges, so, I mean, counting high school, then I went to the Naval Academy, then I went to Maryland. So I never had a black teammate. I don't know what that's like. But in my mind, I think people in the South and people across the country were sick of it. I think they were glad to get rid of this burden of segregation in sports. You know, I remember when I came along, Clemson University was adamant that they weren't going to play if I played. Frank Howard was the coach, and Frank Howard falls into George Preston Marshall, Adolph Rupp school of thought, and he said, no Negroes will ever come in this stadium and play. Death Valley. And I did, and we got through it, and, you know, after that was the last game of the season, and I can remember walking off the field with my Jewish teammate, Jerry Fishman. They didn't like him either. They used to call us, you know, gefilte fish and collard greens. We were roommates. But this guy
because there was no person of color, so they put you with the Jew.
Yeah, he roomed with me, you know. We got along, except the boy was absolutely crazy. But he was also 6'2", 235 pounds, a mean middle linebacker with a real bad attitude. You know, he said, I'm Jewish. He said, as Jewish, you can choose one. You can turn your back and run, or you can stand up and fight. He said, I stood up and fight. So Fishman and I walked off after the game with Clemson, and the sports announcer says, today, segregation in college sports died today, ladies and gentlemen. It's over. And to prove that it was over, just a few years later, in the 70s, Clemson won the National Football League NCAA championship. And I was sitting there on television, and they started announcing the starting lineup. And each and every starter, except the center on the offensive team, was an African American. I said, how quickly they change, and how glad I think people will have to see a change. there's no place for segregation in athletics. And I don't think the average person, no matter how hardcore they are, really want that. And so, and today I don't think they want it. I think it's a real deal, and I think sports has gone a long ways to bringing people together.
You've been listening to the 6th annual Shirley Povich Symposium at the University of Maryland, the Philip Merrill School of Journalism. They're launching a new venture, the Shirley Povich Center for Journalism, which is pretty tremendous here at the University of Maryland. This is Edge of Sports on the PPI Network. My name is Jeremiah Tittle, in for Dave Zirin.
Edge of Sports on the PPI Network.